Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the roadmap for exiting the coronavirus pandemic restrictions that Boris Johnson has finally laid out, and consider to what extent we can believe that it will be implemented as stated and to what extent it even should. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, I have rather mixed feelings about the government's approach to dealing with the pandemic at this stage, this spring and summer. On the one hand, we've learned a lot more since last year. There were some things that had the potential to go badly wrong, but didn't. And so it could be argued that we need not be quite so cautious this year in certain regards. However, there are also things that were very, very badly handled, and not just with hindsight, with foresight. And the pressure within the Conservatives is to handle those things just as badly again this year. Now, in terms of my concerns, take for example the vaccine minister Nadhim Zawahi yesterday saying in an interview that March is 3 weeks, or the 8th of March specifically, is 3 weeks after mid-April. It wasn't a slip of the tongue either, for those who may be thinking, oh, he meant February, didn't he? He's talking 8th of March, that's about 3 weeks after mid-February, isn't it? It wasn't a slip of the tongue, because he said it the same thing in a different interview. And also he was linking it to a point at which over 50s would have received the first dose of their vaccine, which hasn't already taken place. So he was indeed talking about the future, and he was talking about the 8th of March being 3 weeks after this future date, which is indeed, as far as I can tell, in line with the government's plan mid-April. So we have a government minister who thinks that mid-April was last week. We also had the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, talking about March the 29th as the date when children won't be in schools. They're talking about, peeling away some things on the March the 29th. And Sunak going, and this will have eased some stress at that time because children won't be in school, they'll be on their holidays. Now, I can't say that there won't be any children on holidays at that point, because sometimes it varies around the country. But I don't think there will be, because Easter tends to be at Easter. And certainly in my region, the Easter holidays begin a week after that. So what we have here are ministers who are either not studying their briefs properly and therefore don't know what the hell is going on, or they are too thick to understand their briefs and don't know what the hell is going on. Either way, they don't know what the hell is going on. And yet they are still deciding government policy based on complete and utter crap. But let's otherwise kick off with some more hopeful news. Now, based on last year, what wasn't as serious as we may have supposed? Well, outdoor activities are not at all high risk. Of course, we always knew that transmission was much, much less likely outdoors. We didn't need, the fact that coronavirus is new is irrelevant. We know about that ventilation is absolutely key with airborne microbes, and you don't get much more ventilation than outside, especially on this windswept island. So experts now agree that and a lot of them sort of have for some time, that outdoor events, as long as they're entirely outdoor, are very low risk, to the point where you could almost say negligible, as long as you adopt a few sensible precautions. So the crowded beaches we saw last summer that caused such dismay, including from me, were not actually linked to any outbreaks. Where there were what looked like outdoor events that were linked to outbreaks, let's say, for example, the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival event, whatever it's called, that had an indoor element. So they said where you had an indoor element, that's when you had outbreaks linked to it. So when the government say that on March the 8th, two people from different households can meet for a coffee outside, as far as the expert view is, that should be okay. The same with school sports and other activities starting up, as long as they're outside. That is similarly very low risk. I've seen no expert view casting doubt on the sense in doing this. I accept that it's the government have only just announced these things, and it may take time for independent experts to pronounce on it. But yeah, I think that's probably going to be fine. And then, 6 people or 2 households meeting outside for Easter also seems to be not only low risk, but also not being rushed. My only concern at reading this was that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, said on Sunday that the plan was to assess each lifting of restrictions over a 3-week period. So what would happen is you'd lift, so some restrictions effectively have been lifted on the 8th of March. So then what you do is you give it 3 weeks before deciding on the next. So the idea is you allow 1 week to show symptoms. If it's going to cause a spike, then the symptoms develop, and then a further 2 weeks to monitor the impact on case numbers, which sounds fine. That sounds sensible. Until you then start to see dates being attached to the different layers of restriction being eased. So what's going to happen here? Are the government setting out intended dates, but subject to these 3-week reviews between each? And if the review isn't good, they'll cancel the next layer of restrictions being eased? Or are they just saying that they'll review them to make it sound like they're being cautious, but will just strip away those restrictions according to the timetable unless it absolutely completely blows up in their faces? And it could be either. Let's face it, if the government do get the response wrong, it's likely we won't actually see a major impact until autumn. Bear in mind, they were getting everything you could possibly get wrong last year, they got wrong. And yet, we still saw after the first wave lower numbers over the rest of spring and certainly into summer. It wasn't till autumn that it blew up, just like last year. And, in spring and summer, you get more meetings taking place outside anyway. Obviously better weather naturally suppresses the transmission of airborne microbes. But if we take the government at their word at the moment, despite all the evidence to the contrary that we should, then the roadmap as laid out might actually sound like it'd be the sort of thing a sensible government would do after a fashion. I do have one serious doubt, and that is about the full opening of schools at the same time on March the 8th. Now, this is being done without having made them safe in line with the scientific advice. Face masks still don't seem to be mandated, so any schools enforcing this are doing so unilaterally. Yes, you're supposed to wear face masks moving around the school in corridors, but not in the classrooms where they spend most of their time. Air purifiers were advised. That's not being rolled out. Class sizes, reduce the class size bubbles. That's not happening. We also know from the latest research that the newer variants transmit more easily between younger people. Now, last year, the government tried to argue that transmission between young people was much lower, which it was, but they somehow turned that much lower into, basically there's no chance, don't worry about it, not happening. They're immune, these young kids, they're immune to it, which was not true. But have a look at this chart. So this is courtesy of a US-based epidemiologist at Harvard. It shows that during the lockdown, the number of new cases has of course dropped dramatically for all age groups. However, there's a little bit of an outlier. The 5 to 9 age group saw for both boys and girls the slowest drop off. Now, I suspect this is because a lot of kids in that age group have still been mixing in school. If you're a child of a key worker, you've still gone to school in that age range. But the point is that the decline in the number of new cases for 5 to 9-year-olds has been less rapid than every other age group. And when you consider that we largely only test symptomatically, not speculatively, that's an age group where we won't have any idea how much coronavirus is mixing with that group, because they are much less likely to develop symptoms when they are infected. So it downplays the spread of infection in that age group. And now what we're going to do is throw open all the schools, which are known as major vectors of the disease, without applying simple safety measures, and all at the same time. Which means if it does go wrong, it's all right being tentative. If it does go wrong, it will go so badly wrong that it will be very difficult to do anything about it. And the whole point of this roadmap is that we always go forwards and not backwards again. Now, I'm a teacher. I want schools to open. There's too many people who sort of think there's this dividing line on this debate. You either want schools open or you want them to remain closed. This is not true. There are those of us, a lot of us, who want them to open, with safety measures in place. We know that the ones that were applied last year don't work well enough because as soon as schools opened, we saw an explosive second wave linked to it. So why would we make the same mistake? And the vaccine changes nothing in this regard. Almost nobody who will be going to schools, whether students or staff, will have received even a first dose. It's all right, the vaccines minister saying, oh, you know, but by this date we'll have vaccinated all the over 50s. There's only so many over 50s go to school. And also you're opening up the schools, well, over a month before that date. You know, and the other thing is very few people, even nationally, have received their full vaccination. There's a lot of focus on this first dose thing. In terms of the full vaccination, very few. Very few. The lockdown opposing Telegraph newspaper, they were trying to suggest last week that the number of new cases per day would drop to 1,000 by Easter, you know, after the first week in April. This will not occur because the conditions that are creating the current curve from which they are extrapolating will not exist from March the 8th. And what's so special about 1,000 new cases a day anyway? I mean, that is considered to be roughly the point at which it might be possible for test and trace to contain the spread of the virus without lockdown. Although I'm not so sure, we haven't heard anything about test and trace for a while. The incompetent way of managing it hasn't changed from last year, so I don't know that there's any expectation that it will be much better this year. It might be, due to more testing options, I suppose, more advanced testing, which includes the testing in schools that's going to be rolled out as well. The details of which, I'm a teacher and I still don't know the exact details of that. Maybe the government will tell us at some point. Maybe they've told us tonight and I wasn't paying attention and that'll come out tomorrow. But I mean, that's another thing, bear in mind. We were supposed to be, the government said they would give us 2 weeks notice before they open schools. But actually they only announced this last night. Yeah, we sort of knew anyway, the press had been reporting it for a while. But they only officially announced it last night. Now, last night is after the working day of Monday. So to all intents and purposes, that's like Tuesday is a working day. Bit naughty there. Don't see why they couldn't have announced it earlier on. But anyway, there are also things that seem to be genuinely cautious in this. So although I can criticise some aspects of the roadmap, particularly related to schools, for example, last year the government prioritised opening pubs over opening schools. This year seems to be different. Even pub beer gardens are not really supposed to be open before April. They're being very non-committal. No actual date given for this. And that's, you know, that's good. I take that as encouraging because the danger with giving a date, even if it's tentative, even if it's conditional, if you qualify it by saying it'll be subject to review, is what happens is as soon as you give the date, the media just plaster that date all over their front pages. And people will then be annoyed as hell if it doesn't happen. It's like, well, the government said they were going to open it on this date and now they haven't. It's like, no, they didn't. The newspaper just told you that. So not actually given a date might suggest that Boris Johnson is serious about not easing restrictions too quickly. I mean, I've said before, arguably in a beer garden, lower risk anyway, but what happens when it rains? Obviously, I long ago learned to judge by actions rather than words anyway, especially for known liars like the Prime Minister. But those are my thoughts on the roadmap. I would say there are things they could do very easily to make schools safer. Aside from that, if he means it, if they actually stick to what they know here, I'd welcome it. My worry is they don't always do what they say, and the fact that we've had 2 ministers at least yesterday who clearly didn't understand their briefs either because of laziness or stupidity, and it makes me worry when you've got ministers who don't actually understand what their own policy is. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.